Our other discussant is Dr. Marcia Kaplan, who is board certified in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, board eligible in neurology, she is a practicing psychiatrist and psychoanalytic psychotherapist. Her topic is findings regarding firing of single neurons correlating with psychoanalytic models explaining behavior. She is also involved with information processing in what she is calling bottom-up and top-down ways of both the brain and the mind.
I think that the genius of psychoanalysis and Freud's work is really that he understood what we have to be able to do is train ourselves to understand emotion. And it is, it's not an automatic capacity. Most people learn, in fact, through defense to not know what they feel. And the whole process of training to become a psychoanalyst is to become sensitive to emotional input from wherever it emanates. I was fortunate enough to be in a study group with Jaak Panksepp, who is the grandfather of affective neuroscience. The group was co-led by him and Mark Solms, and Mark's work is also works of genius, I think. Jaak explained when we started that he's a neurobiologist. He was formerly at Bowling Green State. Now he's at in Washington State. He was working in a number of areas of neurobiology, but it was when his daughter died she basically fell off a mountain, climbing a mountain in Switzerland. And his experience of grief turned his whole life around, not surprisingly. And he said, the brain is organized around emotion. And it really changed the thrust of his investigation. What's really quite fascinating is that Jaak's ideas and Freud's ideas are overlap in very nice ways. I'm sorry that I didn't have time to make slides to show you, but Jaak postulates that all mammalian brain, and possibly some non-mammalian brains, such as birds, are organized around emotional operating systems. There are 4 that he calls the grade A blue ribbon operating systems. The one that Costa was describing, you can put an electrode in the pons at a particular place, the ventral tegmental area, and the animal will want to explore. It's called the seeking system. In Panksepp's, that was how he wanted to describe it. It is not appetitive. It's not an appetite. It is without appetite. It is rather, it's a wanting to go out and see what's there. It's not with the idea of a goal in mind, that I want to go and eat that food and swallow it. And
so
then
it's curiosity.
It is sort of like curiosity, but it's very, very similar to Freud's idea of drive. Mm-hmm. Now, Freud, of course, separated the drives into the sexual drive and the aggressive drive, and this would probably be closer to the aggressive drive, the wish to go out in the world and do things. And so that's the #1 operating system. Now, the rest of the blue ribbon systems have to do with fear, rage, and panic. and let me explain that a little bit further. Fear has to do with self-preservation. So it's the fight-flight idea, that if you've got a tiger bearing down on you, you need to have an automatic program. You don't need to think about it. It needs to happen automatically. So these are stereotypical behavior that happen without the need for cortex to get involved. And it's true of all mammals. It's true of humans. The rage system is anger. That's different from there's anger, and then there's predatory attack. They're different systems. Mm-hmm. So the cat video that you showed was a nice illustration. Mm-hmm. The rage was the cat hissing and clawing, and so you put an electrode right there, and that's what you get. The predatory attack is a sort of silent, it's not anger, it's aggression, it's pure aggression. I'm going to go out and I got to kill that thing because I got to eat it. And it's not, so it's not anger. Panic system is actually the social bonding system. It's what underlies social bonding, so it's a separation fear. So when we talk about panic attacks, we're talking about the activation of this panic system that has to do with separation. What you want, evolutionarily, is for the baby to not get separated from the mother. Because, you know, if you lose the baby, then you have not accomplished your evolutionary goal of passing on your genetic material. So the panic system actually works. The minute the baby and mother are separate, the baby, what does a baby do? Cries. That's hardwired. So that's a stereotyped program. When the baby is all by itself and it looks around and where's mommy? It cries. Now, that will go on for a certain length of time. At some point, the baby quiets down. And that's when the endogenous opioid system kicks in and quiets the baby, because at least the theory is, if you've been separate from mother for an hour or so, you don't want to keep crying because you're attracting attention to yourself. So predators are more likely to find you. You want to cry so mother can find you. Because if you're in some tall grass, you want mother to know where you are. The vocalization helps her locate where you are. But after some time, you want to be quiet. Mother's not here, so I don't want to be eaten by something. So the panic separation system is what underlies that social bond. Now, there are additional operating systems that he considers a little bit secondary. One is the maternal care system. One is the sexuality system. And one is the play system. And they are slightly less required for, in Jacques, I'm not sure I can explain this well enough right now, but they're not absolutely required for passing on genetic material. So as long as you have that separation fear system, the maternal care system is a nice thing to have. Okay? The lust system is a nice thing to have. Play is a nice thing to have, but you can survive without them. Now, I prepared some remarks to try to bring up a few. The big problem with neuroscience and psychoanalysis is what do we do with this stuff clinically? So that's the continual rejoinder. So what? We still have to utilize our psychoanalytic understanding, and in order to really help patients, we have to use our emotional understanding and our whatever theories we like. And of course, psychoanalysis is not monolithic. It's all kinds of different theories that are really under one big tent. So we have the relational theorists, and we have the object relations theorists, and we have the ego psychologists, we have the self psychologists, we have the drive theorists, and it all of it works together. So, you know, as a psychoanalyst, I can say, of course there's an unconscious. Of course there's transference. Of course there's resistance. And of course, sex and aggression are always being represented in the conflicts that come into the consulting room. But as a neuroscientist, I have to say, okay, well, show me the data. How do I have the proof? So I'm going to just talk a little bit about a few studies and some work by particular investigators that have clinical relevance. One is Helen Mayberg. So the Brodmann maps of the brain, the different areas of brain, are actually relevant. Helen Mayberg, who's now at Emory, mapped the cortex to find where you put an electrode to get a particular state, a mood state. And I think it's C25, 26. There's like one particular area, you put an electrode there, and you can cause immediate, intense depression. You stimulate and you can relieve it. So there's actually, she's done a series of, I think, 8 patients with a deep brain stimulator in this area that has relieved depression. So it's got a clinical application. But this is, this tells me that depression, when we talk about it as a biological thing, is stereotyped. It's a stereotypical disease. And I can tell you when somebody comes in the room exactly what they're going to tell me. I can't concentrate, I can't make a decision, I feel hopeless, I think about death, I can't sleep, I've lost 10 pounds, I don't want to eat, I'm anxious, I can't settle down. And every single patient that comes in with depression is going to tell me those same things. So that, and then of course, when you treat patients with medication and you see it all go away, it's quite convincing, at least to me, that this is an illness. Now, you can also think about depression as a vernacular for sadness and the kind of expectable reaction to current day experience, to loss, to being demoralized, to feeling angry, to feeling socially excluded. Depression is a way that we talk about it. So we call both of these things depression. There may be overlap, but there may not be. Medications may work, they may not. And sometimes psychoanalysis will work, and sometimes it won't. So I think we have to be very careful to learn what does biology do for us? What stereotypical syndromes come from a biological illness? And that's very much affected my work, because I can now kind of listen and think, okay, I know this is an illness, and this is something that is only going to get better with an in-depth investigative treatment. And there's a lot of overlap. So regarding the concepts of the affective operating systems, there are some experiments that have come out of that are really quite interesting. One is Barbara Milrod and her group at Cornell have done something called panic-focused psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So it's based on the idea that panic attacks have to do with the activation of the separation system, and that underlying panic is a separation fear. So based on that belief, she put together a 24-session, two sessions a week for 12 weeks, focused on the panic attacks and the relationship issues underlying the panic. What's the separation fear about? No medication. And she has a very, very nice rate of remission. So this is an NIMH-funded study. It's really lovely. And I actually have a bibliography over here. I made copies so everyone can take one if you'd like to look the work up. Now there's another idea, it's called the social exclusion arena. There's a particular experiment that's called cyberball that you can put your experimental subject in front of a computer screen and say, well, there are two other players in other rooms at different computers that are playing ball with you. Now, of course, there aren't, but that's not what the subject thinks. And at first, the ball, you're using your mouse to throw the ball to one or the other players. At first, there's a kind of orderly, everybody's playing nicely together. And then after a while, the other two are throwing it back and forth to each other and excluding the subject, the experimental subject. Now, this creates a sense of social exclusion. And it's actually been correlated with the elaboration of the endogenous opioid system. So this was a paper in Nature. And anyway, it's in the bibliography if you want to look that up. Now, we know psychoanalysts blame everything on mother. And of course, this has backfired on us occasionally. We have had our excesses, for instance, with schizophrenia, the refrigerator mother idea, that was the cause of schizophrenia. I don't think anyone believes that now. So we didn't always get it right, but we weren't altogether wrong either. And Beatrice Beebe's work is a fantastic way of seeing in real time the interaction between mother and baby. She does split screen video. So she videotapes mother interacting with, she'll just have the mother come in with the baby, say, play with your baby. And just sort of step back and let the camera roll. She then shows you the video screen of the mother's face and the baby's face. And she can slow down the film so that you see in milliseconds the facial expressions of the mother. Now this is the most fascinating thing I've ever seen. The mother, who looks in real time as though she's being appropriate, is making these horrible faces at the baby. So the baby that's crying, you know, these are sometimes failure to thrive babies. The baby's picking up something that's very real, but you can't see it using your, you know, this is where you're, we're using our association cortex to tell us, oh, this is a nice mother who's talking to her baby. But when you slow it down and you see these horrific facial expressions, you can see why the baby's crying. So this is really lovely work. And that makes me think, I didn't put it on the list, but Alan Shore's work is very, very lovely work too. His idea is that mother and baby, mother literally programs the baby's emotional brain. And it's a process of right orbitofrontal cortex communicating with right orbitofrontal cortex through all of the special senses. So mother and baby, through touch, smell, hearing, taste, and of course visual, are connected. And it's literally that connection that leads to circuits being made in the baby's emotional brain. So his work is it's a bit dense reading, but the idea, there's a 1994 paper that's pretty readable. He has many books, and I think they're on our shelves. So we're always wondering about nature versus nurture. And Kenneth Kendler is the guru of the twin study. So he's looked at every twin registry there is in the world. The beauty of twin studies is that you can compare identical twins to fraternal twins to control group or just siblings that share 50% of genetic material compared to 100%. And one would expect that things that are hardwired and genetic will be expressed in identical twins at a rate higher than it would be 50-50. And in fact, that is the case. But he also has shown in virtually every experiment he's done that it works out to be about 50-50 nature and nurture. Now there's a number of these experiments looking at strains of animals that can be bred with certain traits. Anxiety. So you can breed strains of mice that are very anxious, and then a strain that's very calm. Now, you take an anxious mother and a calm mother. Each has a litter of pups. You take the pups and you switch them. That's called cross-fostering. What do you think happens? How do the pups turn out?
Retain the original.
Well, actually, they turn out that if you take calm babies and have them raised by an anxious mother, they're anxious. Yeah, and vice versa. So if you take babies with anxious genetics, but they're raised by a calm mother who does all the right licking and back arching and, you know, all the stuff that rat mothers are supposed to do, and you end up with calm babies. So this is another lovely way of seeing the plasticity of our brain and the effect of experience on what's definitely hardwired. Another concept that I wanted to bring up is default mode network. The idea of the conscious and the unconscious certainly can be demonstrated experimentally. And Lee Bay, I think, is the experiment everybody cites, in which he showed an evoked potential firing before someone knew that they wanted to move their arm. So in other words, there was a plan prior to the individual knowing that I'm going to move my arm and pick that up. So the firing happens prior to the motor action. So this was a kind of fundamental experiment showing that we do have an unconscious mind. Now the hard-nosed behaviorists do not use the word unconscious. They say non-conscious to separate conscious activity and so in other words, they're saying there is no such thing as a dynamic unconscious, which of course we all think is hogwash. And that's where Jacques is a wonderful ambassador for psychoanalysis, because he's got all the credentials of a cognitive neuroscientist, but he is absolutely convinced of the importance of emotion in organizing our brain. So the default mode network is, well, I'm not going to turn your computer back on, but It's midline structures that involve cortex, parietal lobule, medial temporal lobe. So it's a network of neurons that are wired together. It is active when the brain is at rest. So when we're daydreaming, that's the default mode network activity. It goes offline when we are cognitively engaged in a task. So it becomes attenuated when you have to use your executive functions to work on some project or organize some material or read something and understand it. So it's a nice concept to understand, and it probably gets hijacked in states of depression. So that rather than being able to happily daydream, the default mode network is now ruminating about fear and anxiety and terrible things that are going to happen and so on. And it can obviously, each of these areas that I'm talking about have their own neuroanatomy and neurochemistry. And we can have effect on that with medication. Last concept I want to talk about is epigenetics, which it's kind of like the idea of the Lamarckian concept, if you remember from high school biology. So the concept of Lamarck was that if you have a giraffe that stretches to get the highest leaves and the neck gets longer during life, then that giraffe is going to have babies with longer necks. So it's, in other words, it's the current day activity of an individual that can be passed along genetically. Now, everybody said, you know, Darwin is obviously correct, that what it has to do with is that two healthier, more robust giraffes who happen to have been born with longer necks and so that they could get better nutrition are going to have more babies. They mate, they have babies that have longer necks, and that is successful, so they are the ones who are going to mate and have more babies. So you gradually develop, through evolution, this animal that has this hugely long neck. So there's no question that that is how evolution works. The concept of epigenetics, though, is a little bit Lamarckian. So the idea is the experience that an individual has actually changes DNA and can have an effect on the ova that then develop into a fetus, into an organism. There were two experiments that I put in my bibliography. One was about the transgenerational transmission of post-traumatic stress disorder. In that experiment, male rats were isolated and stressed. There's lots of ways you can stress rats until they were really very nasty creatures. Then you take a female rat and put it in the cage, and of course the female rat is cowering in the corner because this aggressive male rat is angry and irritable. Now, they mated, and the baby was separated from the father. So the male rat had nothing to do with the baby, never saw the baby, had no contact with the baby. And was then, there was actually, I think, two groups. One was the mothers nurtured the baby, the actual mother, and another a control mother, a foster mother, to see, you know, should there have been some traumatic stress to this mother caged with this irritable, angry male? Might that affect her mothering? So in order to control for that, you have a healthy, non-stressed female that can raise that rat. Well, these rats, the male rats, become irritable and aggressive. And the concept is that there is actually some change in sperm of this rat that has been stressed. Now, this also has been looked at in it's a separate study that also used rats, in which the mother was exposed to the worst thing in the world for animals is unpredictability of the food source.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a paradigm, this variable feeding paradigm. So sometimes the food is there in the cage, and sometimes they have to forage and go look for food. But sometimes they never know which it is. So this is a very, very stressful situation for animals. Those mothers who are stressed actually express on the ova and in frontal cortex a messenger RNA that leads to an increase in the hypothalamic releasing factor, corticotropin releasing factor, which is connected with stress. So again, it's a change that actually occurs in the egg of the stressed mother and gets passed on through the egg that develops into an organism that then also has stress, is also traumatized. It behaves as though it was traumatized. So there are many such experiments now in ways that we see this concept of epigenetics. It has to do with turning on certain genes through methylation. It has to do with what genes are activated or quiet. It may have to do with transporters for different neurotransmitters. So there are a lot of different mechanisms by which this happens. But it's something that we have to take into account. And I think almost, I don't remember if Rachel Yehuda invoked this idea, but it's long been known that there was an impact from Holocaust survivors on their children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even children who were born in a free country with complete freedom, plenty of resources, caring parents have more difficulty. And this is probably the reason. So there is a change in the expression of DNA RNA that occurs due to trauma. So those are just a few concepts. I could go on, but I think we maybe would be better if we have a little time for discussion. And if anybody wants the list of some of these studies that I cited.
Mm-hmm.
So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Can we get discussion questions for Katja and then for Marcia? Or are there questions that engage both of their presentations? Questions? Yeah.
Shall I first, very quickly?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you have to excuse the format, but
No problem.
the idea behind it was I blogged the event, and I reached out to my students, and I allowed them to post questions in anticipation of your talk. And so they're not directly in response to what you actually presented, but more in response to what they thought you would be talking about. And I think it lines up quite nicely, actually, so I think it works. So here is a summary in combination. This one is from Kurt Kranke, who will actually be speaking here in the fall because Norman has invited him, and the board has decided that his paper topic was very interesting. He has done summer scholar research work on neuroscience and Freud. So here's his question. Although Freud did have a background in neurology when he was developing his psychoanalytic theory, he did not intend for his models of the psyche to have help me out with this.
Neuroanatomical.
Thank you. Neuroanatomical correlates. What sorts of problems do you run into when trying to map models of the psyche onto models of the brain, with the psyche having a different ontological nature than the brain? What benefits can be derived from doing so? Perhaps a more holistic way of understanding behavior, specifically neurotic behavior? That's his question. So the main question, I suppose, would be, what sort of problems do you run into when trying to map models of the psyche onto models of the brain?
I think I could answer that a little bit. So I think that when you look at Freud's illustration of his structure of the mind, there's a distinct unconscious component, the id, and then there's a distinct conscious or preconscious component and a conscious component, and it's superconscious. What is the superego component? But it's not like the brain evolved to have a region that exclusively is devoted to any of those parts. There's a really interesting book for the public called The Accidental Brain by David Linden that talks about evolutionary constraints acting on the development of the brain as evolutionary time progressed. And the idea is that, and I think I tried to point it out a little bit in my talk, which is that every function of the brain has an unconscious and a conscious component to it. There's a really dense interweaving of the two components of our psyche. And potentially the ability for us to become aware of ourselves, which is sort of the important part of being conscious, is almost an afterthought of evolution. It's not the primary goal. We could probably do fine. Well, animals, for example, don't necessarily have an eye associated with them, but they have a mind. The mind is images of the world, and how an experience-dependent modification of those images. We could do fine without a self-awareness. So somehow, and that's somehow we have this reflexive ability to represent ourselves as an object that we can look at in the mind. And that may be, on one hand, an accident of evolution, but perhaps all species are on that trajectory. We just got there first.
Well, and I'll add that the operating systems are important here, because you do have these stereotypical foundational feeling states. What makes human beings different from animals, though, is we have this huge cortex. And it's that frontal cortex that's constantly inhibiting and mediating those feeling states. And that's what differentiates us from our dog. So, I mean, we project all kinds of things onto our dogs, by the way, that probably don't exist. But the basic operating systems are all active, for sure. But it's not possible to say this is where superego resides. Now, we can say that if we look at the cingulate cortex and map the different areas of cingulate cortex, we have an idea how our brain is always scanning the environment and looking for information to tell us what should I be doing, what's salient, what's not salient. So anterior and dorsal are very different. I mean, ventral and dorsal are different, anterior and posterior are different. So there's a great deal that goes on in the limbic brain that has to do with our emotional states. But again, we have to take into account all of this modulation by cortex. So that's why it's impossible to say, you know, even if Helen Mayberg can stick an electrode in C25 and say, see, you have somebody who's completely sad, hopeless, depressed, doesn't want to live, we can still modulate it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's enormous plasticity in the human brain because of our cortex.
I have a question, because I think the questioner that you raised in terms of what you were talking about in terms of Freud talking about a self-reflexivity and then memories being unconscious versus voluntary and involuntary. My question is, we have different metaphorical models for, you're calling them operating systems. Freud called it the ego and the id and the superego. But actually, how do those different metaphors, those figurative constructs, actually map onto one another, or do they map onto one another? I mean, it seems much more plausible to me that when we're talking about physiological process, we're talking about voluntary and involuntary. When we're talking about the mind, we're talking about conscious and unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And what Freud was talking about was self-reflexivity,
yeah.
and how we actively disavow certain kinds of ideas because they don't fit with who we think we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that is quite different than voluntary and involuntary, or what you're calling, and I think at this point in time, it's quite metaphorical, operating systems. These are all different metaphors that we use, and our experience is happening on many different levels. And to map one onto the other without allowing for those what I would call incommensurate languages is not quite fair.
Well, one thing that may interest you is the latest paper by Mark Solms. It's published in Brain, but there's another edition of it published in Neuropsychoanalysis Journal called The Conscious Id. And basically, Mark just turned the whole concept upside down. So, you know, we used to think about the cortex and all of our higher cortical functions being the location of ego. But his idea is that actually it's the limbic and pontine structures that make us conscious. And that is actually required. You have to have the reticular activating system or there's no consciousness. So the cortex may actually be the seat of the id. So he's turning the whole concept upside down. And it is a very, very interesting paper. So Brain 2012 is, just look up Solms, S-O-L-M-S, and you can find it. And the Neuropsychoanalysis Journal is fantastic. I'm still reading and rereading. He published an edition of the idea, and then it's commented on by about 12 different discussants who are all leading lights. So it's really quite fascinating.
Other questions?
I have a response to what you said,
Yeah.
or what your question was about.
Yeah.
Well, I think I've also read a lot about these operating systems that you talked about. The thing is that these researchers that study them really would not think that they're metaphorical. These are evolution. These are hardwired circuits that we've inherited from our ancestors. This would be, I think, something. I don't know if this is correct to say, but if it would, Carl Jung would have called them some kind of collective consciousness, collective unconsciousness, which is some kind of knowledge that we inherit from our predecessors. With the thing that supports all of this kind of research into the emotional operating systems is the fact that you can raise an animal completely independent, never having been exposed to anything. And with electrical stimulation, you can drive behaviors that look like to us fear, they look like to us curiosity. They are panic systems, they are maternal care systems. These are hardwired elements, and the hypothesis is that we humans also are endowed with them. These are real. This is about as physiological as you can get. And what's special about us is that somehow we can control them, or we can get them to, we can ignore their actions, which is, I guess, unhealthy. But
I guess I would still say that Heisenberg is operative, that the system that you use to study whatever it is that you're calling reality is changing what you are studying. And consequently, any language or code that you use to describe it will stop at a certain point, and you will need another system to describe that gap. And that's what I'm saying is we only have language, and we only have systems of language to understand things. And to say, well, Freud was just dealing in metaphorics. My point is we're always only dealing in metaphors. The question is, at what point are you dealing with a division and a point at which reality is just a matter of triangulation between different codes? And why would you overlay one code upon another rather than just respect the fact that reality is unknowable as such?
Well, an interesting, really simple analogy to your idea is that we can study molecules of gas in a room, and we can study billions of them without needing to study each one. We can use a formula, thermodynamic
but
laws
it's
of
still a formula, right?
Yeah, but that is, it ignores the need to explore the activity of every molecule. We have a new language that doesn't care about what each gas molecule is doing. We can explain how temperature spreads in a room. So potentially, at some point, what neuroscience might need to do is to stop paying attention to the synapses and all of the cellular language and talk about computational rules of language, of vision, of emotion. And
then we'll have a formula for everything.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But probably, I don't know, I can't really predict what's going to happen. But maybe the individual cells and circuits might not be important at some point.
Since you raised the topic of Jung, I can't help but to comment. But when Jung talked about the collective unconscious, excuse me, he talked about the so-called archetypes, which are inborn structures, which are often misunderstood in almost a Lamarckian way, that these were things you acquired through experience, which is really not what he meant. He meant that these are evolutionary structures that survive because of their evolutionary value. They're not acquired through experience in that way. But they are common structures, and he likened them to the spectrum of light, that at one end is the ultraviolet and the other end is the infrared, and they touch, like this, the Ouroboros, the snake, the medieval snake that bites his own tail. In other words, the mind and the body are connected. And that only a certain area of the archetype is actually knowable and is available to consciousness. So it really fits exactly with what you were saying, that all these circuits have both a conscious aspect to it and an unconscious aspect. And the unconscious extends both at the level of the body, through the autonomic system and the spinal cord, etc., and the nerves that innervate the organs, the internal organs and the muscles, but also in the mind in terms of the mental unconscious. So in Jung's scheme of things, one of the paradigmatic shifts that he made that I find interesting is that he doesn't see consciousness as above and the unconscious below, but he sees consciousness in the center surrounded by the unconscious, the mental above and the physical below. So consciousness is sort of in the center of things, and again it's surrounded by the unconscious, which again I think fits with your model in these circuits, that there are these archetypal circuits.
Yes. And
by the way, just parenthetically, if you haven't seen the movie Cloud Atlas, I'd really highly recommend it, because it gets into these ideas, the idea of reincarnation of these archetypes through history, and the different figures and the different experiences that people have over time.
Thank you.
Okay,
It's really
thank you.
interesting.